Hello, and welcome to the Bitcoin Roundup podcast presented by Coinbits. We bring Bitcoin news, hot topics of conversation, and deep dives into a variety of Bitcoin topics to you weekly. We are Coinbits, a Bitcoin financial services company. Check us out at coinbits.app. This recording is for informational purposes only. No investment or legal or any other advice should be drawn from this content. And as always, consult an advisor before making any legal or financial decisions.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining Bitcoin Roundup Live. This is hosted by Coinbits. Today, we are very honored to have the awesome Eric Yakes. Welcome, Eric. Glad to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, dude.
Awesome. So if you are new here, if you haven't seen, Eric, in my opinion, wrote one of the best intro books to Bitcoin. It's called The Seventh Property, Bitcoin and the Revolution. If you don't have a copy, trust me on this, go pick up a copy. Your Bitcoin bookshelf is completely missing this book if you don't have it. It actually may become your best orange pilling book for a specific type of individual. So go check it out. The book name again is The Seventh Property, Bitcoin and the Monetary Revolution. It's by Eric Yakes, who honors us with his presence here tonight. So first question, I think the first conversation topic is, how did money, kind of a tool for trade, meant to be, I think, completely apolitical, how did money turn into a political topic? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can jump into this, guys. So look, I think that if you look at history and you consider the evolution of money and how it changed over time, as money started to become more centralized across various functions. And when I say that, when you consider like how primitive monies emerged and they were largely decentralized when they existed in localized groups. So we saw there's kind of like three functions in which intermediaries get involved in money, and that's its production, its storage, and its verification. And when you think about like primitive localized groups, think maybe like a hunter-gatherer tribe or something like that, people were creating money themselves. They were producing it themselves. They were storing it themselves, and they were verifying it amongst one another themselves. And then over time, as we start to see more efficiencies gained by creating centralization within those functions, that centralization was ultimately used as a tool by politics, governments, whatever you want to call it, as a way of intervening in the monetary system. And so when we saw that evolution over time, we saw that probably like the kings of Lydia around 600 BC, that was one of the first very early examples of government involvement in the production of money. And it was very efficient in certain ways. It provided standardized coinage systems because prior to that, people were utilizing gold bars and silver bars to conduct their trade. And you'd go and you'd trade in terms of weight. You'd go to a merchant, you'd ship off different bits and pieces of your silver, and they would say, this is the right amount of weight. And then you move forward. And then eventually they realize, okay, every time we do trade, we have to like chop off these pieces. Sometimes we lose some of our silver in that process or our gold. And it was very inefficient. It was very slow. You had to weigh all the time. So it was actually the merchant class that started creating standardized forms of coinage. And when that started to happen, governments very quickly were quick to utilize that as a scapegoat to say, look, merchants are taking advantage of you guys in some forms. And a lot of that was the coin clipping. And effectively, when people, rather than trust the actual weight of the coin they're receiving, they simply trust what it says its weight is. Merchants quickly realized that they could take off bits and pieces from coins for every transaction. They would clip the edges of the coin, save up enough of those bits and pieces for themselves, and then they could effectively mint new coins, and everybody else is none the wiser. And that was this form of moral hazard that existed by centralization over the production of money. And governments use that as justification to say, no, we need to have the government involved. This moral hazard has to stop. And in some of these early examples of governments controlling the coinage system, the irony of it is that the governments ended up doing the same thing. And like one piece of this that I define in my book is that the 19th century, Karl Menger defined money as the most saleable good. It's the most desirable good. If you had a genie that came to you and said, you can have an infinite amounts, any sort of good, the smart person would say, I want money because you can sell it for anything. And because of that, it's more subject to moral hazard than any other good. We have seen that throughout history, that moral hazard ensues when we give people control over our money. So typically the issues that occurred in the private sector are adopted by the public sector. Now, if we fast forward away from some of these primitive analogies and we go into the emergence of banking systems, we saw a similar trend emerge with the storage of money. And there were efficiencies gained from it where people were like, okay, since we had, and these happen in various periods, assume that over a few centuries, once we had the technologies of like double entry bookkeeping and the printing press and the telegraph, paper money was able to move trade around Europe incredibly efficiently, much more efficiently than just conducting trade in gold. And that was major. It allowed us to trade more efficiently, which means less labor and capital needs to be used to support trade, which can be put to other productive purposes, and societies to benefit very significantly. And it was through that process that we had things like fractional reserve banking emerge, because once again, similar to how people would trust in the coin, they would trust the brand on the coin rather than its weight. With fractional reserve, they would trust the note rather than the gold that's storing it in the vault. And these systems privately emerged, and there are issues with fractional reserve banking. And when we had boom and bust cycles or contractions, or bankers didn't have all the gold that was ultimately stated to back the note, that was used as just to have some sort of governing judgment upon the system. Now, once we got to this level, central banking was much more of a significant revenue generation mechanism for governments. And if you go back to the Roman Empire, it was as well. But so when you consider it at this point in history, when we had that form of revenue generation emerge, that was something that's always been very attractive to governments. And pretty much ever since then, we've always seen these cycles of gold standards emerge. Ultimately, the government creates a central bank. The central bank persistently extends credit beyond what would be naturally reasonable within an economy. And eventually we have these long-term bust cycles. And there's an Austrian school were the ones watching this and they were against it. And then people at the other end of the spectrum were the ones who are much more politicized and said, no, there's benefits to it. And the fact is that they're not completely wrong. And I'm writing a piece that I'm hoping to release next week that's kind of covering what the trade-offs are between some of these areas. But when you have these trade-offs that exist, they can be used to politicize what's going on. And people can say, okay, we can have more stability in short-term pricing if governments have control over it, XYZ benefits occur. And this is just such a complicated area that most people in the world don't have understanding of. And today people are getting a much better understanding of, which is one of the beautiful things I think about Bitcoin. The fact that I remember it was like 3 or 4 years ago, most people I talked to didn't even know the term fiat money. And now I feel like I rarely encounter somebody who doesn't. And that's very good because people need to understand this better. And then the Austrian type thinking, or the monetarist at least type thinking, can start to prevail a bit more. But nonetheless, ultimately, in the simplest form, it's always been used as a form of government revenue generation, and it's always moved out of some of these more primitive societies. And we had government encroachment upon either the production, storage, and verification of money. It's inherently been political once the government had encroachment upon it.
What an awesome summary. Thank you, Eric. I think that takes us quite a bit back into kind of the history of how money formed. And I think you described really well. And for those who are just joining, don't worry, we're recording this conversation. You could listen to it after. And Eric just ran us through how money developed over time and how it became political. So Eric, I guess the next question here is, can money ever not be political? I mean, I guess with fiat money, it's very clear because there's always going to be a source of its generation somewhere where someone is going to have authority to create some of it somewhere. And I think Saifuddin really describes this well in the Bitcoin standard. Whatever humans use as money, it will always increase the demand for it. And so there will always be someone who is able to fulfill that demand of money supply. And therefore there will always be a fight over who gets to create more monetary units. So I guess prior to, could there have been any other solution for money to not be political? I mean, the Austrians obviously love the gold, right? The gold bugs is basically the Austrian school of economics that hasn't yet understood Bitcoin. So is there an option for money to exist in an apolitical fashion outside of Bitcoin? Or will money always be political? I mean, I guess the other part of that question is Bitcoin political now? And that's really the topic for conversation tonight.
Right. So, yeah, I think that the concept of over predication of money, that was the innovation, right? It's something that we can legitimately, in a practical way, do ourselves in that form, where the trade-offs between its efficiency, and this is where we get into the prospective idea of scaling mechanisms and the cost benefits of how that's ultimately going to be practically implemented and how long it's going to take to ultimately build that out. But production, storage, and verification of money at the base layer at a minimum, Bitcoin innovated in the way that now we can legitimately do that ourselves in a highly efficient manner. And because of that, I think it's the first time in history where we can have some possibility of removing the politics from our monetary system. I think it's very possible, but I think that when we can talk about this for quite a while, but when we do the prospective nature of how that's ultimately going to emerge, what the scaling mechanisms are going to be, how centralized that's ultimately going to be, I don't think that any of this is a certainty yet. I think that there's quite a long road ahead, and I think that there's a lot of issues that need to be resolved. But when I think about that and I think about the possibilities being there, I think that on a risk adjusted basis, this is the best bet you can make just from a purely an investment perspective. And then from a value perspective, this is solving the biggest problem in the world. Perhaps we could even look back and say this is one of the biggest problems in history. And there's nothing else I'd want to be a part of, regardless of whether or not it fails.
Yeah, there you go. That's the best shot at it. It's correct. One idea here that and I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate and perhaps share some of the FUD that we frequently hear from no coiners, pre-coiners, even some crypto folks, quote unquote crypto, is the idea that we are always going to have people who have more of the money than others. And therefore, because they have more of it, they have more control over it. And it becomes political in a way. Well, the NVK calls a Bitcoin has basically a one-time Cantillon effect, where the people who have a lot of Bitcoin now get to benefit a lot more than perhaps others. And so what are your thoughts on the idea of Bitcoin tends to centralize or money because of Bitcoin's early history here and not a lot of people having the same access to information and knowing about Bitcoin, that the people who are whales, the mega whales, the people who have thousands of Bitcoins, the Michael Thaylors of the world, they get to have a higher political, let's call it a higher political stance on Bitcoin and its further and kind of its future than others. What are your thoughts on that, Eric?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'd say is how else do you do it? Number one. And number two, that is an argument that's true of any emerging economy. And by economy, I don't just mean a sovereign economy. I mean any sort of type of economy that emerges, like people who are early investors in Amazon. Anybody who's taking a significant risk at the inception of something that's going to provide a significant amount of economic value to the world, they're going to benefit very largely from that. And when we apply that to a monetary system, but I mean, all of these things, if you look at like the development of economies and these measures of wealth inequality, like a Gini coefficient, these follow like an inverted U curve typically. And I see no reason why you wouldn't see that for Bitcoin as well. As it emerges, there's a degree of wealth inequality. It continues to increase for a period of time. And then it ultimately reverses. And like for Bitcoin, it's because you can't live inside Bitcoin and you can't eat it. So eventually you're going to have to move it into some other asset that has some sort of utility value to you. And I think that those things will resolve themselves. And the people who are risk takers, that very much supported this network, what they've had to do to ultimately take that amount of risk and then ultimately had the resolve to hold it for the period of time that they will have to like achieve that economic benefit. It's more than deserved. It's deserved in any form of capitalism.
Awesome. Great answer. London, welcome to the speaker board. You have a question. You've had your hand up. Thank you for being patient. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I was just listening, but same with the political side of things. It's one thing about Bitcoin is it's borderless and stuff like that. So when we talk about if it's political, I think it makes it not political, but it also means you could be in a very lucrative country and people will travel to that country for a better life and stuff. But Bitcoin now, you can now take your trade or what do you believe that you wish to do in life and that you could take that to anywhere in the world and still be financially secure. You're able to take that what you're worth to anywhere in the world, really. And that was the point I was really going to make. I only wanted to make up. But this is.
Yeah, thank you, man. That's a really good point. I think to reiterate what you were saying, Bitcoin basically gives you the power to exist outside of the control. Take your resources, take your money, take your savings outside the restrictions of the state. And that is kind of that's kind of the stake in the ground that we put right with Bitcoin. It's apolitical in that there is no one who could force you to give up your Bitcoin. Whereas every other form of money we've had before, right? Not to get too graphic, but someone kills you, they can grab that money, right? They can take your gold, they can take your silver, they can take your seashells, they can take your salt, they can take your cattle. All those forms of money that are physical in nature that we've had before could always be confiscated. And that's what tended to centralize fiat money and other forms of money prior to Bitcoin. And that their ability to be confiscated is what made it possible for governments to really form in the way that they formed and for fiat money to eventually develop. So that's a really good point, London. Thank you for sharing that thought. So I guess to kind of take us into more of the political aspects of this, as the conversation was kind of initially targeted to talk about. Eric, do you think Bitcoin aligns with one political ideology, let's call it? Because we know the political parties in today's world are a bit of a scam, right? It's a bit of a mess. But do we think that Bitcoin aligns with the political ideology of one political ideology more than another? I mean, I think libertarianism kind of comes up as probably the most frequent ideology that Bitcoin seems to be in support of. But there are gaps, right? There are different streams of ideology within libertarianism. And there are also other ideologies where perhaps Bitcoin aligns more closely. What are your thoughts on this? Does Bitcoin align with one ideology better than other ideologies?
Yeah, so I think that I think a good way to put it is that it probably more or less will, depending on the stage in which it's at. And there's the Taleb quote: "To my family, I'm a socialist. To my community, I'm a Republican. To my state, I'm a Democrat. And to my country, I'm a libertarian." And I think it's something similar like that, because if we think about the long-term concept of wealth creation for the entire globe, the destruction of all of these centralized organizations that have been implemented throughout history for rent-seeking behavior and to control power and ultimately toward all these unproductive purposes, as that's reduced, that's just more wealth for everybody. And that's not political at all. That's something that everybody wants. And once we get to that scale where that's happening in a variety of different ways, we can go down into the details and we can talk about all these other different ways where it might align with this party at this stage in time or that party at that stage in time. But I think that early on, it's a libertarian ideology, and then eventually it might start to step into the other bounds. And we're starting to see that occur right now.
Yeah. So so let's talk about that. How is it stepping down? There's a big movement in the Bitcoin space now. Maybe not too big. But Bitcoin Twitter is a bit of a bubble. But perhaps on Bitcoin Twitter, there's this ideology that perhaps Bitcoin is apolitical, as we mentioned. But there is a good faction of people who identify as perhaps socialist, or I don't know what the proper term is. Maybe socialism within libertarianism. I don't know what the proper term for that is. But there are different angles to this thing. Where do you see this trend going?
Yeah, so I didn't watch that podcast, so I'd be kind of curious to hear what the ultimate thesis of that thinking was. I don't know. Do you have that?
I haven't listened to it myself either, but
Okay.
just judging conversations on Twitter, it seems like it was very divisive.
Right. Yeah, I think that there's a variety of different ways that this is. I don't know. I think that there's a lot of context from which you could think about it. You could take one dimension, one aspect of Bitcoin. It's an innovation across a variety of different dimensions, and you could say whether or not that's good or bad for one particular party's beliefs. But yeah, I mean, in terms of socialism, I don't have anything really strong to say about what the ultimate benefit of that's going to be. I think that with what we're starting to see a lot more of is the liberal ideology and some of the benefits of energy, as well as disintermediated payment rails and how that can support the development world, as well as break down a lot of these trades that are currently in place. And I think that those are more in line with the current party, but I'm not a super political person, and it's not something that I focus on all the time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good place to leave it. I think that more broadly speaking, right because of fiat money, we've gotten to the place where basically because of the situation where we have haves and have-nots, there's a bigger and more growing demographic of have-nots because of the money supply control and because of fiat money and because of what it does and because of its ramifications. Then those people who don't have much, right? People who are in the have-nots category, because they're ever growing, there is always a political angle to tailor to those people, right? Voting in the majority of the world is essentially a popularity contest, right? And so as long as you're able to tailor to as many of those individuals, which is a growing segment in populations worldwide, you're then able to gain their vote by promising them free things. And so that's why there's this entire angle that politicians, and politicians on both sides really do this, at least in the US here, do this really well, where they tailor their communication to those people. And here's what we're going to give you, and here's where it's going to come from. When in reality, it's a fiat money thing. But as long as we have a voting process that works in the way that it works today, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome plays out. And so there is going to always be demand for free things. And this concept of, I need someone to bail me out and give me because I'm suffering because of XYZ, when in reality, the real issue is fiat money. And so Bitcoin fixes this, right? Bitcoin fixes the political ideology differences. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a chat with the Ben Prentice and Heavily Armed Clown, and they were talking about some of the charts that they have on the F happened in 1971.com. And you could see it clear as day, where political ideology was kind of, in the beginning half of the century, was getting more central. People were able to have conversations with one another. People are less and less basically divided. And 1971, go full fiat. And all of a sudden that gap starts to grow and growing, where people who are red leaning go more that way. People who are left leaning go more that way. And it became a mess. And so it's completely a result of fiat money. So completely understandable that maybe that's where we leave it. So more practically, Bitcoin speaking, right? Bitcoin is the separation of money and state. Bitcoin fixes this by getting rid of controllers of the money supply. And so basically everybody has an equal opportunity to live on the Bitcoin standard on the topic of future governance, right? And perhaps this is kind of in two stages. Initial stage, and sorry, Joe, I see your hand. So go ahead, sir.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to chime in here on this topic, like real quick, and because it interests me, and I kind of want to know your guys' thoughts. I think it's pretty clear where libertarians stand, as you guys noted, and then maybe even those on the right who kind of see this kind of growth of government, growth of authoritarianism, growth of globalism kind of creep into their lives, and they don't like it. I think maybe Ted Cruz visiting a coin mining farm this week. So I think those on the right tend to be maybe a little more receptive to Bitcoin, but those on the left, it really interests me because initially you think no. And I think there's a lot of evidence for them refuting Bitcoin or being scared of Bitcoin or pushing it away or saying it's some cap or libertarian tool to undermine all the good the government's doing or whatever. But on the other side of things, if you're dealing with someone with liberal values and they really care about things like financial inclusion and decreasing this incredible wealth disparity that's just growing year after year. We mentioned what WTF happened in 1971. If you look at some of the charts since 1971, it's absolutely mind blowing. And if those are your actual values, right? We're not just pandering or virtue signaling. If Bitcoin is undeniable to solve those things. Now, in supporting entitlement programs and the growth of government, obviously that flies in the face of that. But I guess those are my thoughts. And then my question for you guys is, what do you think about that, those on the left? And then what direction are they going to ultimately go? And is there a way to kind of change that direction? Or is it just, those are kind of unsalvageable, and then we focus on the people who understand it and understand what this thing's all about and share the same values that we do?
Yeah, it's definitely much more aligned with the Republican Party talking points. I guess on the liberal side of things, the battle is fought not in the trenches. And I think a lot of that's going to come from I think the battle being fought is going to be at the media angle. And the question is whether or not our community and how that grows and what it expands into is ultimately going to be able to battle that against some of the larger media. I mean, the benefits are there. There's no question about that. The narratives around those benefits for the average individual are challenging to understand. And that's where the education piece on all this comes in big. And I think that the Bitcoin community has been making quite a bit of progress on that angle, but we have a long way to go. And the start to get that media angle turned, particularly from the left, that's where the battle is going to be fought. And I think that's going to be pretty challenging.
Yeah, it's definitely all about education on that front. The direction of the conversation, I think, might be more interesting for discussion here. And like you were saying, Eric, we don't ball and we don't know which way this is going to go yet, but we're going to go to a place where just by Bitcoin's mere existence and Bitcoin continuing to grow, we're going to have to go to a smaller governance structure of some kind. And Bitcoin's future in the world, I don't think is uncertain. I think it's going to continue to grow. And as governments try to get on the Bitcoin standard, try to collect Bitcoin from people to operate, the form of governance is going to exist. What do you think? When you think about the future of that world, and perhaps it's in two stages, like I was saying, where it's step one and then step two, and perhaps some form of gradual steps in between. How does Bitcoin as a future of money impact the future state of governance? What will governments look like? What can they do? What can they not do? And how does that impact who gets to serve on a government in the future?
That's interesting. I guess I don't have a very strong take on a lot of this, but I think that there's going to be a huge reduction. If you can't control money, you can't have the revenue generation to support all the functions that they're doing. They can't control the property rights and wealth of all these other people. Assuming that we get to that scale where that's a reality, then a lot of functions will ultimately be adopted by private markets. Some will go away completely, and good riddance. And more pointedly towards your question of what does it look like in terms of how a government will be, I guess the only answer I really have to that is I think that as a general trend, it's probably going to be something that's significantly more localized. These broad reaching power structures to be so much harder to maintain. And when it comes to like libertarian ideology, I don't like to put myself into like any sort of political group. I just like to think about and have my concepts around what I think is a solution to some of those. I don't think the libertarian ideology is perfect. And I think a lot of that comes down to how natural monopolies are formed and how negative externalities occur. And I think the libertarian ideology says that the unnatural monopolies, for example, like that's just something that's created by government. There's definitely truth to that. But I think that we need the technological level to get to a point where mobility is so easy for people, that reality of being able to reduce a lot of natural monopolies can ultimately go away. I think that'll be one big thing, and that's a very utopian vision. I don't know how long down the road, but I think that when we get to that state, it'll probably be much more localized groups that exist, and it'll be the political nature of how that actually works will be something that's just more community based.
Gotcha. Makes sense. So for a thought exercise, let me know if you don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but as a thought exercise, let's talk about the one topic that I think, in this future governance model potential that people usually have the biggest question on, and probably biggest, what's the word? Maybe opinions on, right? Biggest fear point maybe for some people is, let's say the police, right? Let's play this out here as a thought exercise. Let's say that, like you were saying, political, federal type political activities can't really take place. So it becomes local. And so let's say that a local police force were to develop in, let's say, someone's local town. I think what Bitcoin forces, right, is anybody who has that skill set that wants to work in a security type setting or securing their neighborhood or their city, they're able to do that. And perhaps a monopoly forms for a group of people that say that they can do this one job really well. But I think what Bitcoin forces is, as soon as that group of people that will say serve as the local police, Bitcoin world, as soon as they try to step out of bounds, or as soon as they try to perhaps abuse their power, or if they don't do a good job, what Bitcoin allows for is basically anybody with that skill set, anybody who is entrepreneurial in that way, or anybody who has skills to offer that could be beneficial to their community, they can step in and the community can all of a sudden rally behind that group of people. And it's basically free market competition for anything that government does. I mean, is there any one field? I picked police, for example, but is there any one, or security more generically, is there any one field where you would have to have a monopoly, where people wouldn't be able to as easily overthrow the group of people who's running that service for them that typically governments provide?
Yeah, I think it's just when you have, so fundamentally, the nature of policing or defense for that matter, but let's just refer to policing for considering the domestic level like you're describing. If localized societies are going to protect property rights, then if you have a policing group, just that it all inevitably has some sort of responsibility where it's given a privilege over that. It is violence that emerges to ultimately do that. And I think when those systems emerge privately, perhaps they could be a lot more efficient, but it is a form of violence that'll encroach on society. And I think the question is what is the deterrence theory against that? And then how much can against that be scaled? And what I mean is, like, In the military, deterrence theory is the concept that you can deter certain actions from other governments if you have a gun. And as they know that you have a bigger gun, they're never going to try in the first place. And when I haven't really thought about that much at like a localized level, but I think that the ability of Bitcoin to move outside of the system and maintain your own property rights in like a monetary form is really valuable. But we still are dealing with a lot of real world assets. And when we have localized groups that are policing in localized areas, for that to emerge completely privately and for some people to ultimately have some sort of violence that emerges over other people, what stops private markets from responding to that? If it's not okay with it, and then will that ultimately accretive to the group, or will it be a constant battle and some sort of order needs to be put in place and people elect groups to have that privilege over the violence? It'll certainly be more competitive because it'll be in localized groups, but a vision that I think a lot of these things go away is I don't exactly see how that would occur.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think there is a good distinction that you made there about physical world assets, like real physical things that you need physical defense and security for, that aren't as easy to move with you, like say money is. But I do think, all things considered, the ability to move money with you, dematerializing a lot of what is today basically money incarnate in the form of buildings and real estate and things like that, really pushes down the incentive for people to cheat. I think the other thing too is a lot of times we forget that, I don't know, it's hard to play this out, but let's say if we do go to a Bitcoin standard world and everybody has an equal chance at winning inside by playing, by basically being good to other human beings, by providing value for others, the incentive structure for people to want to commit crimes really goes down. I mean, theft, right? I mean, we have legalized theft today, but let's say theft, for example, if you want to protect against real physical world theft, I mean, the incentive for people to steal is because they feel like their effort into trying to is going to be higher than if they were to go and try to steal from someone. So if we flip that incentive structure, if all of a sudden it's less incentivized and it's easier for you to go out and actually earn a living by providing value for other humans, I believe most people are good. I think most people will actually go out and spend their efforts on trying to provide value for others as opposed to try to get rich quick by, say, for example. So I think the demand for, if society gets to that, and that's the big question, right? If society gets, I wonder if the demand for secure on the physical real world assets is because of it.
Yeah, I'm certain it'll definitely decrease. Yeah, the vision of whether or not that would be actually functional within groups at scale, I think is challenging. A lot of people are inherently good, but more above and beyond that, people are inherently self-interested. And when conflicts of interest emerge, moral hazard ensues. And yeah, I don't have the best faith in people, and that's probably because I work in finance.
Well, that I guess, and upbringing have a lot to do with it, and definitely work field. Let's go to a slightly different topic. Is what about shared resources? I think the favorite example of anybody who kind of opposes any libertarian ideology is, who is going to build the roads, right? Who's going to build my roads? What are the thoughts on things that have to be somewhat shared? Can we go to a world, can Bitcoin allow for a world where things become completely privatized, completely private property, the classical, the rare sense where we have private sections of different roads and things that are shared resources like that? What are your thoughts on that, Eric?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people ask this question from, is it possible? Could we do this? And while I think that there's a lot of angles you could take on how private markets could do something, I don't think it's the right question to ask. I think the right question to ask is, it something that will be demanded by society? And ultimately, will, large groups of people make some sort of trade-off where they say, yeah, sure, like I'll do this by example. So like, consider like telecommunications infrastructure. If Going back to my point about mobility, if mobility was resolved very easily, consider if we had the innovation of transportation and people could just transport to new areas, then a lot of these kind of natural monopolies that emerge in like utility functions, they would have to compete against people all across the world. And then now who ultimately demands their goods and services, they have to compete against everybody else to kind of remove that function of that natural monopoly. But because that's not a reality yet, I think that it's possible that, sure, if we were to have government encroachment removed from utility functions, private markets would come in and say, okay, we can create a lot more redundancy in infrastructure. We can have multiple telecom networks that exist within a localized area. And it's like, okay, how long is that going to take? How much investment is there going to be that goes into that? Private markets probably could do it, but are they? Are people going to actually demand that? Are they going to say, oh no, I prefer like my utilities to actually be something where the prices are controlled by a government? I think that's kind of the key distinction, is asking whether or not people would ultimately demand that in a private market format, or if they would make that trade-off. And you want to give people credit, but it's media at scale today, and it's very hard to get ideas pushed. And if there's always going to be people who want to have power, and therefore they're going to want to be the person that steps in and says, no, I can protect you and I can save you from this. And if the private markets aren't efficient enough at something, then that's an attractive environment for those type of people to emerge.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think if we broaden the scale a little bit of what Bitcoin is able to do, I mean, ultimately, Bitcoin as free market money, by making money more efficient, it makes markets more efficient. And so wherever there is value exchange in any type of market, that, that ability for someone to rise to power and say, no, I will protect you, or in any field, right? Or I will do this better than so and so. I think what Bitcoin does is people to vote with their free market money. And as soon as that person who is unable to, say, follow through on their promises, whatever that promise might be, Bitcoin allows the market to vote basically in a way that gets rid of that person and allows capital to flow to the best producers. There's being perhaps communication methods, or electricity providers is another big one. Like I think it was Jeff Booth who talked about basically power providers at scale. Like we don't want, for example, I think I agree with this. Maybe I'm not educated enough on the topic, but I think the idea is there are certain things that we want to have centralized. It would be very inefficient, for example, to have a completely decentralized, completely privatized in a sense where each group acts in their own best interest power provider, right? Because grid, at least the way that it's structured today, would have to have some kind of central, we want the efficiencies of centralization, but also the ability to get rid of a central authority that is inefficient, if you know what I mean. Like if they're not able to provide the value that the customers want. So I think Bitcoin fixes this by basically allowing the free markets to operate in as efficient a way as possible, whereas money today just completely escapes that possibility.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that it's obviously going to make all this so much more efficient, to your point about having the ability to opt out into your own form of property right that can't be controlled by any sort of sovereign or government institution. That is a huge form of deterrence theory against political moral hazard. And I think just when you get down into the practical granularities of it, I don't think that it fixes, I think that it fixes a massive amount of it, and life would be pretty good in that form. And also political actors would act very different when you have that. And perhaps those centralization benefits of commerce among people would ultimately be something that can be much better managed by some form of politics in a localized group.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what about CBDCs? So we know that there are countries who are in the very late stages of testing their CBDCs, and the Federal Reserve seems to be flip-flopping on this. Different speakers have different opinions. Perhaps that's a good thing that it slows them down. But the idea of a central currency, ultimately the utmost form of political money, right? Where a central authority, and they can claim that they are disconnected from governments all they want, but a central authority basically gets to completely control the form, allows people to go out and conduct trade. So it becomes, I can't think of an example where money could be more political, right, than centralized like digital currencies. Do you think we actually get to that? Do you think that we get to that utmost political form of money, even more political than fiat money that we have today?
So I think that it would be a horrible thing if that occurred. But do I think that if we get there, I have a lot of faith, and I think that we're watching these battles begin. But I have a lot of faith in this argument that was ultimately successful under Phil Zimmerman in the PGP era for that protocol of code is free speech. That I think is going to be incredibly important. And I also think that's helping to spread a strong narrative today with just breaking down the CBDC concept for people too. So in our current system, in our current financial system, we have we have these banks that are participants with the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve has an account for these banks that exist there. And the Federal Reserve has control over that, and they can control these banks. They can control a lot of different, they're a regulator to them. They can control how much they're required to have in reserves. They can control the overnight lending of interest between them. There's all these different functions that they have, but they don't have perfect control over private market money issuance. And there's still a large degree. They can't just simply go into your bank account and turn your money off. Why? Because, well, they might have Federal Reserve Bank. There's other banks outside of that system, and they can't just go and they'd have to go to each separate bank to ultimately do that. So the CBDC concept is effectively that everybody would have an account at the Fed, every individual, and it would just be the highest form of fiat centralization ever. And that would be a horrible thing. I mean, if they ever did get that degree of control at scale, I can only imagine all the horrible things that would occur because of that. And that's definitely, that's probably the biggest risk to a society that exists right now. And I think that ultimately, whether or not that's going to occur, I bet in North Korea that it could occur. I have confidence in the international game theory of the emergence of Bitcoin and the private systems that can emerge on top of that. And the question becomes, how rapidly will that occur within the amount of time we have before the media arms themselves with alternative narratives? But I think we're freeing enough society to where we can ultimately get to a point where people understand money well enough, they understand how our banking systems work well enough, they understand all the horrible problems that are being caused in society. And this narrative is something that ultimately won't get pushed. And yeah, that's pretty much my take. I think Bitcoin's going to win. And even if we don't get to that point, then I'd much rather fight till the end on that.
For sure. Joe, share your thoughts.
Eric, just a quick question to follow up on there. You said you think people understand money well enough. Can you expand on that? And what do you think, I guess, the general population, what they think about money and their understanding, and I guess the level of pushback they would give to something like a CBDC?
Yeah, so I think there's the money layer of it, and then there's the privacy layer of it. And privacy started to emerge as like a pretty big political topic. There's a lot more public interest in protecting their privacy in a lot of different ways. And we see a private market response to a lot of that, which is good. And going back to the point about cryptography and how they won that battle back in the 70s and 80s, that's something that'll be really important. And I think it'll be a big part of this narrative. So I think that's one of the important pieces. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. And I guess we get in our bubbles, right? Of whether it's Bitcoin Twitter or the people around us that we speak to Bitcoin about on a daily basis. And sometimes I'll go outside of that bubble. And like, I personally had dinner with a longtime friend of mine a couple of weeks ago who thought the dollar was backed by gold when we kind of got into the conversation. And I guess I just go back and forth on what people think about money and their full understanding of money and how much we're taught about money versus something like macroeconomics or microeconomics in school. But I think the privacy factor is key, like you said. That's an interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, like my anecdotal take on that is, yeah, it's funny you say that. I can't tell you how many people still think we're on the gold standard that I talk to, which it still surprises me when it pops up. But it's actually, yeah, it's a very common thing, and I hadn't totally noticed it. But I think a lot of people are starting to realize, and I think 4 years ago this wasn't the case, particularly like pre-pandemic. People are starting to realize the concept of fiat money and how it can just be endlessly printed. I think one of the big questions that was emerging with a lot of people is, why do we pay taxes? And I think that's a great thing to double down on when you're talking to normies, is just to ask them that question. If we can just print money, why do we pay taxes? And then that gets them thinking about what the trade-offs are of being able to do that. But I'd say the average person probably still just has no clue what's going on, and it's just money and that's it. And then there's an emerge of like people outside of the Bitcoin world that they're starting to realize. Their take is the Fed prints money, they print too much money, politicians finance themselves with that. And I think it's a good thing, but I think the other hard part is when you have kind of a more simplified view of how these systems work, and then they go have a debate with like one of their liberal friends who might have an understanding around how it's a bit more complicated than just that. That's where these debates get tricky, because like to really understand these questions, it requires hundreds of hours of research. And I don't know if we're going to quite get there with a lot of people. I think we can get to a critical mass where a large chunk of people who are very influential are ultimately promoting these. And I think that we've made there's so much traction being made in this angle, and so many people are starting to ask these questions. So I think it's changed rapidly in recent years, but I still think the average person is very clueless about what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. I think Joe, you reminded me of this incident that Eric, actually, funny enough, it happened with your book. So I was heading back from Florida a few months ago. It was probably like March timeframe. And I was rereading The Seventh Property, and the person next to me on the airplane looked at the book and saw Bitcoin on the cover, Bitcoin and the Monetary Revolution. And by the way, if anybody who has joined recently doesn't have a copy of this book, your bookshelf is definitely incomplete without The Seventh Property. Definitely go pick up a copy. But anyway, so he saw that I was reading about Bitcoin, and he said, "Oh, what do you know about Bitcoin? And what's the big deal about it?" And I said, "Bitcoin fixes money." And he said, "We have all the gold in Fort Knox, so how does Bitcoin fix that?" I was just like, "Okay, all right, we're gonna have an orange pilling session here on this 3-hour flight." Quickly running through the book here to see what figure I showed him. Oh, here it is. It's figure 2020 in the book, where basically, Eric, I think you did a really good job illustrating a lot of the concepts, which I think taking pictures of them and sending them to Normie Fett is a good way to orange pill people. But figure 20 basically is how like Goldsmith Bank's reserve system actually worked, right? Describing the depositor, the vault of the bank, and the banker, the borrower, and any other kind of third party. Eric, I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't know if you're looking at the figure, but maybe take people through that to kind of describe how that fraction would have worked, and how your thought process behind writing and putting that together.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to the one where I show a graphic and I say, here's how people think it works, but that's actually not right. And then I have another one below it and I say, it actually worked. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, it's effectively like so what was interesting about that period of time is that there was government wealth appropriation that was occurring. There was a lot of money that was stored at the London Mint, a lot of gold for different people. And it was Charles I who appropriated that wealth just for lavish spending. And then property rights were infringed upon by the government. People were much more scared. And we started to see this private banking system emerge. And we had goldsmiths who were smithing gold. They had a lot of infrastructure set up. And that was kind of like this banker class that started to emerge, and people were storing their gold with them and paying them a fee. And then that's when we started to see these paper receipts emerge, because people are like, okay, well, if I want to conduct trade, they deposit their gold in the vault and then they would receive a paper receipt for it. And over time, paper receipts were much more efficient for conducting trade. They're much more portable. And because of that, you didn't have to lug gold around everywhere. So people started to just trade receipts between one another. And then when that trade started to occur, people started to trust the receipt itself rather than whether or not there ultimately were reserves backing it. What was interesting about the system is it's like, okay, there were receipts being issued and some people and the goldsmiths behind their back were like loaning gold out. But it was actually, it was a full reserve system where they weren't loaning the gold out. They were just loaning out more receipts. So like the key takeaway is that once you have trust and an alternative form of monetary media, that it can ultimately, in that value of that monetary media is a derivative of some underlying commodity or other monetary media, that you can ultimately manipulate the supply of that, your benefit or to somebody else's benefit, or however it works, whether it's private or public. And through that process, that was ultimately like the creation of fractional reserve banking. And with a lot of justification for central banks, and these are complicated points in history, and there was a lot of things going on. There was a Napoleonic Wars going on too, and that was another justification for this. But there's a lot of the issues that emerged from fractional reserve banking, where goldsmith bankers were expanding receipts far beyond the amount of gold reserves that they had, that ultimately were used to justify the necessity of central banking and how it sees cycles. And then I can talk for a while about this, but there's a lot of arguments about banking theory and whether or not fractional reserve is inherently bad. That's one question. But whether or not fractional reserve is ultimately going to emerge in private markets and whether or not it's going to be demanded, historically it was something that private markets would naturally go to. And I mean, you can go to Austrian thinkers, and I think it was Mises and Hayek were both saying they're of the opinion that ultimately, if you are trying to implement some sort of full reserve system, when we're talking about paper and gold, that there would actually have to be some sort of government intervention that didn't into a reserve system. Now, when we think about that on Bitcoin, it's a very different picture. And I'm actually going to release a writing probably next week covering a lot of these concepts. but there's a lot of very distinct innovations within Bitcoin that could potentially limit the emergence of fractional reserve systems on top of it. And it's a complicated argument to go into, but I could probably stop there.
Yeah, no, looking forward to that piece. And I think you touched on a lot of things that we here at Coinbits actually try to emulate in our pipeline, right? How do we create a financial services experience people are familiar with that they can relate to in today's world, and then also future world thinking and how the Bitcoin economy is going to work, and how do we build for that as well. And so all our products in Coinbits that app are kind of being geared for that environment. And I'm definitely looking forward to hearing and reading what you have to write about that. David W., you came up here on the speaker board. Do you have thoughts to share?
Yeah. So one thing that we were talking about, like the future of Bitcoin and does Bitcoin have a future? And one thing that I'm optimistic about is when you look at like the history of sound money, you look back at Mises, what he writes in the Theory of Money and Credit. Mises says that sound money was devised as an instrument for the protection of civil liberties against despotic inroads on the part of governments, right? So like the state is just bad at money. And people realized that then. And when Mises is talking about it, he says it was an experience that could be perceived by a larger public than the narrow circles of those conversant with economics. So like it's coming from the people who are demanding a money isn't bad, right? People want to store their value in something that really like holds that value, right? And so I think that in general, right, like people, even though we've had 100 years of fiat government Keynesian brainwashing, right? There is a demand for good money, right? And so I think that's one thing that makes me optimistic about Bitcoin. And another thing actually that I just thought was funny while I was looking back at Mises's Theory of Money and Credit is that when he's talking about how people should write about sound, should write about economic, he actually says a sound doctrine can win only by exploding the delusions of its adversary. I was just going to say, it sounds like Mises would have been a Bitcoin maximalist if he were alive today.
There is no question about that. He definitely would have been Bitcoin maximalist. We have been talking about Bitcoin and politics and how politics got involved into money just through the evolution of money, the demand for it, and the hope to basically control its flow.
It was refined by the classical liberals, but it really came from people who were annoyed that the kings were debasing their money, right? And I think that you basically see the same thing with the Federal Reserve today. And when you think about something that's a good money, you would not expect the money on the market to be paper, national, or under the control of a government, right? So that's something that makes me optimistic about the future of Bitcoin, is that even though brainwashed by 100 years of fiat, that people will kind of just by out of necessity have to get on Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think you're right, David and Eric. I don't know if you caught all that, but I think the main point here is that because Bitcoin exists, because there's no putting the genie back in the bottle, right? Bitcoin exists. The world has to deal with it. Bitcoin is, right? As the famous saying goes. The fact that we have an opt-out, the fact that, as Eric was saying earlier, we have a way to basically, in a self-sovereign way, move our wealth wherever we want to and need to. The demand for sound money will always exist. We have sound money now. And so in a weird way, kind of in an ironic way, David, as you were saying, because people demand sound money, because, well, against the kings, as Eric was saying, would debase them. And because Bitcoin is basically that's for today, it is kind of a political movement in that sense, right? We will overthrow the powers that be merely by purely opting out of that system, by the Bitcoin ecosystem, and by DCAing every day. Shout out to Coinbits, DCA. And so the way that I think is best described is it's a political movement to opt out of the political system that has put us in the hole today, that has created this fiat world that we all live in, and gives us an option to build a better world where there is no central authority issue money, and so therefore we have to deal with it, kind of thing. So even though it's kind of an apolitical tool, Bitcoin is many things, but one of the things is that it's an apolitical tool. It allows us to overthrow existing politics that just don't meet the demand that we're looking for, specifically the demand for some money that can't be debased, money that can't be devalued by its central issuer.
Sorry, I haven't been able to hear anything, but I also have to jump in a second here. So this might be a good time for me to jump off and not muddy this with my connection.
Yeah, no, Eric, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts. Eric, do you want to give people a plug to follow you, see where your writings are going, and anything other than your book that you want to point out to people?
Yeah. Yeah. Just give me a follow on Twitter. It's pretty much what I spend all my time on. And yeah, check out the book. It's something that I geared more. My background was in finance. So when I got into the industry, I wanted to gear something more towards financial professionals. And to my surprise, it ended up being received well by a variety of different groups. So it's kind of a good starter book for people who are serious about understanding Bitcoin. And yeah, next week, I think I'm going to be dropping a Twitter thread going over some of these questions of, will fractional reserve banking emerge on Bitcoin? Will it be some type of free banking system? Will we see a full reserve system emerge? What are the benefits and costs of both of those things occurring? And what are ultimately the constraints that might enable one system to exist over the other? And then I kind of get into like the practical implications of what that could look like on Lightning. So I'll probably drop that next week.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Turn on notifications so that when you can see when Eric drops that. Looking forward to reading that, Eric. And thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, be careful. I'm probably going to shit post a lot before then, so you may not want notifications. All right. Thanks for having me, guys. Later.
Yep. Take care. Thank you. David, you got interrupted with that. Go ahead and finish your thought there.
Oh, yeah, all good. I was just saying that to me, Bitcoin is sound money. Sound money is anti-despotism. It's not really political parties, whatever. If you're a despot and you want power, then Bitcoin stands in your way. And in my opinion, if you're a despot because of Bitcoin, you will lose. That's pretty much my thoughts on the topic.
What a way to conclude that. Awesome. Thank you so much. We covered a lot of ground today. We covered things from how money turned political, what money was, how it turned political, to Bitcoin basically becoming the separation of money and state, and what that means practically for governance structures, for social ramifications, for shared resources. If you joined late and you missed all that, make sure you give this a listen after it's being recorded, and it'll be available on our Twitter account. Does anybody have any final last thoughts, questions, comments, things they want to add?
Yeah, I would just say, I think Bitcoin is a limit on political power. To your guys' point, to check on those who want to make money political, because Bitcoin is money, and our money today obviously has become politicized. That doesn't mean money is supposed to be political, where there are powers and people who benefit from politicizing that money. And I don't think there's really much better evidence or a time in human history for that than what we're living through right now. I mean, one thing I would just cite, I guess, is this Inflation Reduction Act that we passed a few weeks ago, where we spend $500 billion to actually curb inflation. I mean, this is where of money. And I think Bitcoin is the antidote to that politicization. It's a difficult word to say. And I think that it'll frustrate the people that want to manipulate the money and politicize it, but it's bringing back money to what it should be. And that's a medium of exchange of value for those who want to produce for others. Yeah, and that's my final thought on Bitcoin political. I think it takes the politics out of money, which is a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. What a way to finish off an awesome conversation. Guys, give us a follow. We host these. We like to discuss different topics. We usually pick a topic that is being discussed in kind of the broader Bitcoin Twitter, and sometimes we pick evergreen topics, but feel free to join us. We like to have as much interaction with the Bitcoin community. So anybody who wants to speak is welcome to, unless we have kind of a specified speaker and we want to do an interview style state. So thanks so much for joining. Check out coinbits.app. Go follow Eric Yakes, pick up his book, The Seventh Property. It completes your Bitcoin bookshelf. And thanks so much for your time, and we'll talk again next week.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Bitcoin Roundup podcast presented by Coinbits. So what do you think of the conversation? Share your thoughts with us on Twitter @CoinbitsApp. And be sure to subscribe to be notified of our next episode release. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time on the Bitcoin Roundup podcast.